On a cool Saturday morning in April 1969, the Dawson County Equipment Auction stretched across a dusty field outside Lexington, Nebraska, like a parade of fading ambition. Rows of tractors, plows, and rust-bitten machinery stood under a pale sky, each piece waiting for a final judgment in dollars and knots. At the far edge of the lot, almost as if it had been exiled, sat a 1948 Farmall M that looked less like equipment and more like a relic abandoned by time itself. Its once bright red paint had dulled into a tired brown. Its tires sagged and cracked like old leather, and birds had claimed the air cleaner as their private residence. Someone had scratched the word junk across the hood, and no one had argued otherwise. Ethan Cole stood near the back of the crowd, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on that forgotten machine as if it were speaking only to him. At 22, he didn't look like a man about to make a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. But there was a stillness in him, a quiet kind of certainty that didn't need permission. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning chatter as the final item approached, his tone carrying the practiced rhythm of someone eager to finish the day. "All right, folks, last item," he called, gesturing lazily toward the Farmall. 1948 Farmall M, sold as is. Been sitting since 52. Probably good for parts. Maybe. Do I hear $50? The question hung in the air and dissolved in a silence, followed by a ripple of low laughter. People shifted their weight, glanced at each other, but no one raised a hand. The machine might as well have been invisible. "Come on now," the auctioneer pressed, forcing a grin. $50 for a piece of history? Somebody's got to want it. Nothing. Even the wind seemed uninterested. He was already beginning to turn away when Ethan lifted his hand, calm and deliberate. "50, he said. The word landed softly, but it carried just enough weight to turn heads. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. "I have 50. Do I hear 60? Silence again, thicker this time, laced with curiosity. The crowd leaned in, sensing entertainment where there had been none. 50 going once, the auctioneer began. 75, Ethan said, his voice steady, bidding against himself, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deep inside him. This time the laughter broke loose, louder, sharper, echoing across the yard. A few men shook their heads. One slapped another on the back, grinning at the absurdity of it. Who raises his own bid for a machine that can't even turn over? The auctioneer wasted no time. Sold. $75 to the young man in the back. He struck the gavel quickly, as if afraid Ethan might climb higher still. Son, you just bought yourself either a genuine antique or the heaviest boat anchor in Nebraska. More laughter followed, rolling like distant thunder as Ethan stepped forward through the crowd. He counted out the money in small, worn bills, each one representing hours of work, and took the receipt without ceremony. The paper felt thin in his hand, almost insignificant compared to what he had just claimed. As he turned away from the table, a large figure stepped into his path, blocking the light for a moment. Richard Hale stood there in a crisp shirt, the scent of aftershave clinging to him like confidence made visible. He was the kind of man people listened to without thinking, the kind who sold machines that gleamed and promised ease. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "I hear you just spent $75 on that pile of rust." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard gestured toward the lot where newer tractors waited like polished soldiers. "Do you have any idea what $75 could have done for you? That's a down payment on something that actually runs." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I can fix it." The words were simple, but they didn't sound like a guess. Richard laughed, a full, confident laugh that drew attention from nearby men. "Fix it? That thing hasn't run since Truman was in office. The engine's probably seized solid. You'd spend $1,000 and a year of your life just trying to make it cough." Ethan repeated himself, quieter this time, but somehow more certain. "I can fix it." Richard leaned in slightly, lowering his voice in a way that was meant to feel instructive, almost kind, but carried the weight of dismissal. "Listen, son, you're young. You don't have the luxury of mistakes like this. That's not an investment. That's throwing money away." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he looked past Richard, toward the rusted tractor sitting alone at the edge of the field. And something in his expression shifted, as if he were seeing not what it was, but what it could become. "My father used to say," he began, "the worst thing a man can do is let other people tell him what's possible." He stepped around Richard without waiting for a response and walked toward the farmel. Behind him, the laughter lingered, but it no longer sounded quite the same. It was thinner now, less certain, as if it had already begun to doubt itself. Ethan reached the tractor and placed a hand on its cold, rough metal. Up close, the damage was worse, the rust deeper, the neglect more obvious. But none of it pushed him away. If anything, it drew him closer, like a puzzle daring him to try. Around him, the auction continued to dissolve. People drifting away with their purchases and their opinions. But Ethan remained there for a moment longer. Standing beside the machine everyone else had dismissed, unaware that hidden within its silent engine was a story waiting patiently to be uncovered. A secret that had outlived its owner, its era, and nearly its purpose, waiting for someone stubborn enough to listen. Ethan didn't move for a long time after the crowd thinned and the last of the auction noise faded. Into the distance, the field, once alive with voices and laughter, settled into a quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself were watching to see what he would do next. He walked slowly around the tractor. The next morning arrived with a pale wash of light slipping through the cracks in the barn walls, catching dust in slow motion and laying it gently across the tractor's scarred surface. Ethan was already awake. He had barely slept, not from worry this time, but from the restless pull of something unfinished. By the time the first week bled into the second, Ethan had reached the heart of the engine. The head came off reluctantly, lifting with a stubborn groan that echoed through the barn as if the machine were protesting the intrusion. What lay beneath confirmed what he had already suspected. Spring turned to summer, and summer leaned slowly toward fall, and still Ethan worked. Time, once something he measured in days and obligations, began to reshape itself around the rhythm of the rebuild. Mornings belonged to the fields he still had to tend with borrowed equipment. Long hours under an unforgiving sun, doing just enough to keep the land from slipping further out of reach. Evenings belonged to the barn, where the rail work waited, quiet and patient, exactly where he had left it. Nights belonged to study. Manuals spread across the workbench, pages smudged with grease and graphite, diagrams traced and retraced until they stopped being drawings and became instinct. He learned the language of tolerances and clearances, of thousandths of an inch that meant the difference between motion and failure. He learned which imperfections could be corrected and which would come back to haunt him if ignored. There was no teacher now except repetition and consequence. The engine block sat mounted and bare, its surfaces cleaned down to raw metal, every flaw exposed under the harsh light. Ethan built what he did not have. A crude, boring rig assembled from scrap steel and an old electric motor. It wasn't precise by the standards of a machine shop, but it was precise enough for a man who understood what he was asking it to do. He worked slowly, checking and rechecking, shaving metal in careful passes, bringing the cylinders back into alignment with a patience that bordered on obsession. Mistakes were not allowed. There was no money to cover them. When parts couldn't be saved, he found ways to replace them. Orders sent out to distant suppliers. Weeks of waiting. Packages arriving with components that still required shaping, fitting, adapting. Nothing dropped cleanly into place. Everything demanded negotiation. The pistons came next, oversized blanks that needed to be matched to the newly bored cylinders. Hours turned into days as he filed, measured, adjusted, chasing a fit that felt right. Not just looked right. He trusted his hands as much as his tools. The sensitivity built from years beside his father guiding him through each decision. Outside the barn, the world continued its quiet commentary. At the feed store, men shook their heads when his name came up. At the diner, the story of the $75 tractor grew with each telling, stretching into something closer to legend than fact, always ending the same way, with a laugh. Even Richard Hale passed by once, slowing his truck just enough to see Ethan bent over the engine, then shaking his head as he drove on, a grin visible even from a distance. None of it reached inside the barn. Inside, there was only the work. Weeks became months. Months folded into a year. By the time the next spring returned, Ethan stood in front of something that no longer resembled the machine he had dragged home. The engine was whole again. Not new, not perfect, but rebuilt with an understanding that ran deeper than any factory specification. Every bolt tightened with intention. Every surface accounted for. He wiped his hands and stepped back, letting his eyes move over it slowly. This was no longer a gamble. It was something earned. Still, there was one more moment waiting. The one that would decide everything. He moved to the side, checking the fuel line, the connections, the timing he had set with such care. Oil filled, coolant steady, battery connected. The tractor sat quiet, as it always had, but now the silence felt different. Less like absence and more like anticipation. Ethan climbed onto the seat, the cracked leather familiar beneath him now. Part of the process he had lived inside for so long. His hand hovered over the starter for a brief second, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment carried. A year of work, a year of being told it couldn't be done, a year of proving something to himself that no one else could measure. He pressed the starter. The engine turned once. Heavy, resistant, then again, a cough, dry and uncertain. He adjusted the choke, listening, feeling for the response. Another turn, another sputter, and then, suddenly, a sound that didn't belong to memory anymore. The engine caught. It roared to life with a rough, uneven rhythm that filled the barn, bouncing off the walls, shaking dust from the rafters. Ethan didn't move. He just sat there, hands still on the controls, as the machine came alive beneath him. The sound smoothed gradually, the chaos settling into something steady, something real. Heat built. Oil began to move through channels that had been silent for nearly 2 decades. The tractor breathed again. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A quiet release that carried something deeper than relief. It wasn't victory in the way others might define it. It was confirmation. He guided the tractor forward slowly, easing it out of the barn and into the open light. The sun hit the metal, revealing every imperfection, every scar that had been carried through the process. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't polished. It was honest. Ethan stopped in the yard and let the engine idle, listening to it as if it were telling him something he had been waiting a long time to hear. Down the road, unnoticed by him, a truck slowed just slightly as it passed. Richard Hale glanced toward the sound, toward the sight of the impossible made ordinary, then pressed his foot a little harder on the accelerator and kept going without a word. The years that followed did not announce themselves with the same drama as that first ignition. They arrived quietly, one season folding into the next, measured in planting and harvest, in weather patterns and repair work, in small gains that only made sense when viewed over time. The Farmall became more than a machine. It became a constant. The discovery did not come with noise or drama. It arrived the way most important things do, quietly, almost by accident, in the middle of work that had been done so many times before it no longer required thought. It was early autumn when Ethan began his yearly maintenance on the Farmall, a ritual he had followed without fail since the day it first ran. Fluids checked, bolts tightened, systems inspected. It was routine, and routine had a way of revealing what change tried to hide. He was cleaning along the lower edge of the engine block when he saw it. A line, thin, subtle, running just along the seam where the crankcase met the block. He leaned closer, wiping away grease with the edge of a rag, narrowing his eyes as the line came into clear view. A crack, small but real. He had seen enough of them to know what they meant. Left alone, it would grow. It always did. Slowly at first, then all at once, until the entire structure failed. He straightened, letting out a slow breath, already turning over options in his mind. Repair it. Replace it. Either way, it meant going deeper than he ever had before. The engine would have to come apart completely. Not rebuilt, not adjusted, taken down to nothing. The decision came without hesitation. If he was going to keep the tractor alive, he needed to understand it fully. Not just how it worked, but how it had survived this long in the first place. The disassembly took days, then weeks. Each part removed with the same care he had given it years before. But now, with a different kind of awareness. He wasn't learning anymore. He was confirming. The engine came apart layer by layer until only the bare block and crankcase remained, exposed in a way they never had been before. That was when he noticed it. The space. It was slight. Not something that would catch the eye unless you were already looking for something that didn't belong. The dimensions didn't quite align. The interior depth of the crankcase was off by just enough to feel wrong. Ethan paused, measuring with his eyes, then with his hands, tracing the interior surface slowly, deliberately. There, a seam where there shouldn't be one. Not factory, not standard. He stepped back, mind sharpening instantly, every sense narrowing onto that single inconsistency. "What are you hiding?" he murmured. The metal showed signs of alteration, subtle weld marks that had been smoothed over with care, disguised well enough to pass unnoticed for decades. Well enough for him to miss it all those years before. But not now. Not when he was looking at it like this. He reached for his tools, not rushing, not guessing. Each movement precise. He cut along the seam carefully, following the line that someone else had created long ago. The metal resisted at first, then gave, opening slowly, reluctantly, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. When the plate finally came free, Ethan set it aside and looked inside. For a second, he didn't move, didn't breathe. The space within was small but deliberate, lined and sealed against moisture, preserved with the same intention he had noticed years ago in the oil and the casing. Inside, wrapped tightly in oilcloth darkened with age, was a bundle. Ethan reached in and lifted it out, the weight surprising him. Not heavy, but substantial, real. He sat on the workbench and unwrapped it slowly, layer by layer, the cloth peeling back to reveal what had been hidden for more than 3 decades. Money, old bills, worn but intact, their edges softened by time. He stared at them, not immediately understanding, then counted, once then again more carefully. The numbers settled in his mind with quiet certainty, more than he had expected, more than made sense. Beneath the money was something else. Paper, folded, protected in its own layer. He unfolded it gently, revealing a document first. A deed, land, 40 acres, dated decades earlier, tied to a name he didn't recognize. And then the letter. The paper was thin, the ink faded but legible. The handwriting steady in a way that suggested someone who had taken their time with every word. Ethan sat down without realizing he had moved, the barn falling away around him as he began to read. The voice that emerged from the page was calm, direct, carrying the weight of a secret that had been held too long. It told of the moment on a roadside, of money that had not belonged to the man who found it, of fear, of temptation, of a choice made not out of greed, but out of desperation. It told of guilt that lingered long after the moment had passed, of an attempt to turn something wrong into something that might, in some small way, balance the scales. The land, the money, the hiding place. All of it laid out with a kind of quiet honesty that didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. When Ethan reached the end, he didn't move right away. The letter rested in his hands, lighter than it should have felt, considering what it carried. Around him, the barn was silent again, just as it had been the night he first brought the tractor home. But this silence was different. It held something new, something that hadn't been there before. He looked at the money again, then at the deed, then back at the machine, now opened in a way no one else had seen since the man who had hidden these things sealed it shut all those years ago. "You were protecting something," he said quietly, more certain now. "Not just the engine." The answer, it seemed, had been there all along, waiting beneath layers of steel and time. Preserved not by chance, but by intention. And now, for reasons Ethan could not fully explain, it had found its way to him. Ethan did nothing with the discovery for several days. He wrapped the money and the documents again, set them in a clean drawer, and went back to work as if nothing had changed. The field still needed tending. Repairs still waited on his bench. The world had a way of insisting on its ordinary demands. 20 years after the morning, he raised his hand in a field full of doubt. Ethan found himself standing in a place that looked almost unchanged. The Dawson County auction still gathered its crowds, still arranged its lines of machinery under open sky. In the years that followed, the story settled into the kind of quiet truth that no longer needed telling out loud. Ethan reduced his fields, kept only what he could tend with care, and let the rest go to younger hands who still carried that restless need to prove something to the world.